May 5th, 1861, the Battle of the Puebla. What actually happened?
Well, we have to understand, first of all, the effects and the impact of the Civil War. So, in our last episode, just a few minutes ago, the southern states had just seceded to form a new country with a new constitution, which is almost a word-for-word copy of the United States Constitution, only that it names and protects slavery and white supremacy forever. So the Confederate guns fire on Fort Sumter and the Civil War is on. You have a few months later in July the very first encounter between the United States troops and the Confederate troops, or the North and the South, and what happens? The Union Army loses. It's a disaster. They're in shambles. They run back to Washington. And people are just shocked. What happened? We thought we were bigger and more powerful than the Confederacy. And from that point on, particularly in the Virginia theater of war, it just seemed like the Union Army was unable to win a battle. And people began to lose a little bit of support. They thought it was going to be over in a couple of days. And it was started to drag on to months and then to a year. And people were beginning to wonder, wait a minute, this is supposed to be a bloodless affair. Is the Confederacy possibly going to win? And of course, for Latinos, the Confederacy had expanded. Arizona was part of the Confederacy. The Confederacy was up to the Colorado River, and they were very explicit. Their next stop was the port of San Pedro. Now, for Latinos who didn't like the notion of slavery and white supremacy, this is a little bit worrisome. What's going to happen if the Confederacy wins? That's when they hear about the French troops now landing in Mexico, marching towards Mexico City, and they're thinking, oh my God, it's like the Civil War has expanded. I mean, everyone knew that Napoleon was very friendly with the Confederacy, so if there were a French regime in Mexico, they would probably help the Confederacy, certainly at least cooperate, if not actually formally ally themselves. And if they did formally ally themselves, that's all the Confederacy wanted, is just one country to recognize them as an independent country, and basically they won the war. And it was looking like this was going to happen in early May 1862. But before the French troops could get to Mexico City to depose President Juarez, they had to go through this little town called Puebla. And on May 5th, they were stopped. Now, it took 3 weeks for word of that to get from Mexico City down to Acapulco, where then the news was put on the steamship that came from Panama, one stop in Acapulco, the next stop 2 weeks later, San Francisco. Here, the Spanish language newspapers wrote their stories, printed their papers, spread them all around, and the next day, Latinos here read, Viva Mexico! Viva Zaragoza! But what was really important to understand is it had a different effect here. It was interpreted differently here in California than it was in Mexico. In Mexico, to this day, the Battle of Puebla, oh, well, la-di-da, the Mexican army beat the French army. Well, here, the effect that it had was very different. After a year of hearing of nothing but federal defeat after federal defeat, this was like a ray of hope. Suddenly, for the first time in a major battle, the Army of Freedom and Democracy, i.e. the Mexican Army, but the Army of Freedom and Democracy finally beat the Army of Slavery and Elitism. And it just had an electrifying effect on Latinos all over the West.